Today, who is still abroad. I'm joined by Daniel Sonabend, who is a London-based writer and historian. He's been working on telling the story of the 43 Group for the past 7 years. His new book is called We Fight Fascists, the 43 Group and the Forgotten Battle for Post-War Britain. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Alex, thank you for having me on.
Oh, welcome. And obviously today we're going to talk about the 43 Group. It would be a bit weird to have you in to talk about anything else. Just for our listeners, because people might not, we have quite a dedicated anti-fascist audience listening to us, but people still might not be clear about who the 43 Group were. So who were they, and why did you spend 7 years of your life writing a book about them? What do you think was important about the 43 Group?
The 43 Group was an anti-fascist organisation that was formed by predominantly Jewish ex-servicemen in 1946 when they returned home from the war front, and they saw that British fascists were being allowed to go back onto their streets, resurrect their organisations and their movements, and began to start harassing the Jewish community again. And they reacted to this with complete, total and utter outrage and decided to defeat the fascists by any means necessary. I've been working on this story for so many years because, honestly, I just loved it. I love these people. They were sort of young men and women. They were audacious. They had a whole load of chutzpah. They were charismatic, and they were willing to put themselves out there for a fundamentally vital cause. They were willing to risk injury. They were willing to risk arrest, imprisonment, because they did not believe that a country which had gone to war to fight fascism should tolerate fascism existing on its own streets.
1946 was obviously only very little time after the Second World War had ended, and it must seem remarkable to people that, you know, fascism had any kind of swing or sway or energetic vigour on the streets of London after, you know, the Blitz and like a whole world war that was ended in the defeat of fascism. Why were they so energetic in coming back out the gate so quickly? Maybe you could say what they were doing during the Second World War as well.
Absolutely. So in May 1940, the British government extended Defence Regulation 18B, which enabled them to round up and intern the fascists without trial. They saw the fascists as a potential fifth column threat. If the Nazis launched a successful invasion of the British mainland, they saw the fascists as potentially undermining morale in the war effort, and they believed that it would be far safer to keep all the fascists interned. Over 1,000 fascists were interned at the height of 18B, and they were held in various camps around the country. The largest was on the Isle of Man. What the British government was not interested in doing was re-educating the fascists. And so the fascists were all basically put in these camps together with only each other for company. And this stoked the fires of their zealotry, and they only became more committed, more dedicated, and their anti-Semitism and their hatred of Jews only grew, because who else could be blamed for their current predicament than the Jews? So when they emerged, they emerged even more zealous and even more rabid than they had been when they went in. And the other thing about having this 18B status was that it was a mark against you. So many people would shun you. And so the fascists really only had, plenty of fascists only really had each other for company. Mm-hmm. So for many of them, there was no other option other than sort of going back into their old ways. And, you know, they believed that, I don't think they saw the fascist momentum necessarily having come to an end. They didn't realise that the country has in some way turned against fascism, because in many ways it hadn't. The British people did not necessarily equate Nazism and fascism with, let's say, a soapbox speaker in Ridley Road talking about how it was the Jews' fault that there was some rationing going on. You know, there was a difference, or they saw a difference, or they didn't see the similarity between necessarily Nazism and what the British fascists were saying. similarly, we're also talking about a period where, although there is ostensibly some form of revulsion to European fascism and Nazism, the conditions were perfect for the thriving of a fascist movement. There's rationing, there's austerity, there's potential economic turmoil. The winter of 1947 is one of the bitterest in decades. The conditions are miserable. Then you also have events in Palestine where the British military are fighting Jewish paramilitaries. That's only leading to an inflaming of anti-Semitism. So all the conditions are there for the fascists to succeed. On top of that, the British public did not see a connection between being anti-fascist and being anti-Nazi and not being anti-Semitic.
Right.
Britain did not go to war to stop the Nazis' anti-Semitic policies. There was no need to lose your anti-Semitism. So the fascist anti-Semitism did not revolt, did not make the British public recoil in the ways we might think it did.
And I guess some of the fascist activists that weren't interned obviously fought in the war as well, and we've decorated war heroes to some extent. So, yeah. And also I would add on to your kind of list of conditions that there was a bunch of young men who were demobbed from the military and coming back to poor prospects who had this kind of camaraderie and fighting kind of spirit in the war, and now were back on the streets of Britain without much to do, I guess, is another factor.
Absolutely. And you also have all the young people who, grew up during the time of the Blitz, which is a period of excitement and a period of danger, and you're playing on all these bomb sites, and then the peace becomes boring. So when the fascists, in particular an organisation called the British League of Ex-Servicemen and Women, begin holding meetings in East London around areas like Ridley Road in Dalston, and these start attracting very large crowds, they're attracting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young people who just are looking for a bit of action. So certainly there's this sort of, it's providing an outlet for lots of different people.
I'm interested in the role that Oswald Mosley played in this new fascist coming out of internment camps, because obviously he was the central figure of pre-war British fascism. Was he like eager to get into the fray? I mean, he was like a rich guy, he was an aristocrat, he had country houses all over the place, or was he, what was his kind of attitude towards a new kind of British fascism?
Oswald Mosley is released from internment in November 1943 under very strict conditions. He's released because of health reasons. There's a fear he might die in prison. They don't want to make a martyr of him, but they release him, and he's not allowed to have any communication with his former colleagues. He's not allowed to print, he's not allowed to publish. But he begins to slowly make contact with people on the outside. In May 1945, these restrictions are lifted. He calls his closest lieutenants to his Dolphin Square flat in Pimlico, and he tells them that he is going to retire. The time is not yet right for the fascists to come back into the open, or for him to come back into the open. An election has just been called. He knows he doesn't have the time to mobilise politically to have any success in the election. So he decides it is best for him to retire, to farm pigs, to think, and to write. So he very much pulls back, but he's very much operating from the shadows. He has a very strong interest in coming back. He has his lieutenants set up book clubs all around the country. In 1946, he goes on a tour of the book clubs. He starts publishing, and he's very much giving nods and winks to various of his lieutenants or various people who are setting up new organizations, as they all sort of start vying for his attention and his favour. There's a lot of infighting amongst the fascists. There's a lot of competing. They're all trying to have the movement which, when Mosley returns to politics, he will sort of take on that movement, and the person who set it up will be his number two. So he's from basically 1945 to the end of 1947, he is ostensibly retired, but he's very much involved, and he's very much has an interest in what's going on.
A particular detail that struck me when I was listening to some programs about the group was the kind of fascist kind of misapprehension about what Jewish people were and how they kind of what they looked like. So you have this classic anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jewish people, but then they were confronted by these quite virile young men and women who were quite happy to punch them in the face. I'm interested in this kind of, because it kind of seems like they're shooting themselves in the foot with this kind of this conception of Jewish people that they've got into their heads and they've kind of assimilated. It's difficult to phrase this question, but like, how deeply ingrained was anti-Semitism in these people? Like, were they like presenting these images as like propaganda, or were they like, is this something they actually believed?
I think we're talking about people who have been not necessarily immersed, but been very conscious of anti-Semitic images and anti-Semitic ideals, which have been around for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. The stereotype of the Jew is strong. It is Shylock. It is the hunchback tailor and the moneylender with his crooked nose. He is demonic in some senses. He is horrendous, yet somehow a sexual predator. He is very much seen as this sort of, he sometimes portrays an octopus or a spider, animalistic.
It's like his Fagin character.
Yeah, Fagin, Shylock, exactly. And that's, how plenty of people in Britain would have, had a conception of the Jew. When Jewish children were evacuated during the Blitz, I believe I've heard stories where, they went to towns and villages where people hadn't seen Jews ever before, and they were asked to show their haunts. So, we have these very strongly... we have these very strongly embedded ideas in British culture writ large over what a Jew is. And some of these, and plenty of these fascists, have this, and they, this anti-Semitism that they feel is virulent. It sort of completely, it's like a disease. It runs through them. It takes, it's
like a brain worm, like it's just buried right there deep inside.
Exactly. So they're very much shaped by the way they're seeing the Jews. Now, there is some debate over whether all the fascists were actually anti-Semitic, or whether they were merely using the Jews as a way to target a particular group of people who were anti-Semitic. There's questions over whether Mosley himself was particularly anti-Semitic, but they very much saw the Jews as an excellent political target, which, you could use to mobilize large sections of society. So when the 43 group comes along, this is an entirely different form of Jew than the fascists had ever encountered before, because possibly many of them had not encountered Jews, or they saw them just, those in East London might have seen the religious ones and the black cats, and they think, okay, that's what a Jew looks like. But they don't necessarily equate the Jew with plenty of other people in the East End of London who look exactly like the East Londoners. Mm-hmm. And the Jew and the young Jews growing up in East London, in the East End, were facing anti-Semitism from the moment they walked into the school gates. They had to be taught. They grew up fighting. Some of the best boxers in Britain in this period, in the 1930s and 40s, were Jewish. They were boxers, they were martial artists, they were wrestlers. These were tough people because you had to be tough in order to survive. And, then plenty of them went into the army and really, learned how to be tough. And they were coming out highly decorated, having served in multiple theatres of war. These were very, very tough people.
That's the particular thing that really struck me when I was doing some research for this program was the members of the 43 group did not just get their training in the army. They got their training growing up in East London, or growing up fighting every day on their way to school or in school. And it really struck me that particular little fact. But I think another thing that struck me about the group is how quickly how quickly it spread, how quickly it kind of grew, how quickly it got itself organised, how it attracted a newspaper, how it got this massive intelligence network so quickly. And it was all over in a very short amount of time as well. How was the group organised in an era without the internet or WhatsApp chats and stuff? And how did it manage to keep itself active and organised in this era of like phones and paper and not WhatsApp?
So the group is founded in the winter of 1946. It closes in the summer of 1950. It begins with around 43 members. The group is named after what one story goes. The group is named after its original 43 members. It quickly grows to having a few hundred members, and then potentially it roughly has about 2,000 members at its peak. It has at its heart two men. One is a chap called Jerry Flamberg, who is an ex-paratrooper. He's an ex-prisoner of war. He is deeply charismatic. He's a great leader. He is well loved by everybody. He leads from the front, and he is the figurehead. He's the shining light, and he's the person who attracts people to the group. But it has a second man called Jeffrey Bernard. Bernard is the sort of organizing genius behind the group. He has a sort of, I think he's quite a cold and calculating thinker. He's quite Machiavellian. He's very precise. He's very intelligent. And he is the person who really helps shape this organization, along with an executive of people, many of whom had, roles of serious responsibility in the armed forces. So these people really know how to organize. And organizing at a period when there is, as you say, no WhatsApp, no vocals, poses a real challenge. Group members have to be relied upon to turn up. They're told, this is the time and this is the place, and people don't show up, you're several men down and you could be, completely screwed. You also have to, it's a completely volunteer organization. It functions, or it sees itself as a sort of a paramilitary organization, as many of the people were, as I said, ex-servicemen. So they see themselves running this organization as a military, but it's completely volunteer. So there's no form of disciplining people. The most you can do is kick somebody out or give them a stern warning, but you don't really have any sanction against them. So you have to really hope that people are reliable, that they are just going to turn up. Active volunteers come to the headquarters and, see what can I do, when can I do it. The group has is split into different sections. It's primarily a London-based organisation, so the sections are based on the areas of London, North, West, Central, South and East, with the East End section being the most notorious. So very much it has section heads and section leaders and field commanders who can then organise with their smaller cells within those groups. So there's a sort of a pyramid level going on. They're also, they communicate via postcards. If there is a meeting that they really need people to come to, they write the address of the meeting, and they write the word Arnold on it. And if you saw Arnold on a postcard with a date and a place, then you knew you had to be there. On times when they weren't necessarily sure where to go, there were a couple of times when they only learnt the locations of meetings on the day. People would gather in each other's homes, and often in the homes of someone's parents, because the parents were the people who had the phones. So you might have 10, 12 members of the 43 group just crowded around a small living room waiting for a phone to ring. The group also has a very active secretarial pool. All the secretaries are women, because the group sees this as the best way to give women meaningful work within the group, although there are plenty of women who want to actually go out and have a punch up as well. And this secretarial pool can organise and mobilise the group very quickly. So it does find ways to be able to move a few hundred people within a few hours. And
what were the activities of the 43 group once they got organised?
The 43 group is primarily a street-based organisation. It sends its members to fascist meetings, originally to heckle and to barrack the speaker to make sure they're not getting their message across. When they see that this is not working particularly well, they begin to use more direct action, going for the platform, finding ways to close meetings, starting fights, generally causing a nuisance, hoping that the police will step in and close the meetings. As well as that, they publish a newspaper called On Guard, which is a fascinating paper because it very much tries not to be associated with the 43 group. It doesn't work as a news sheet for the 43 group. It's very interested in prejudice and race-related issues and anti-fascism issues around the world. It reports on lynching in America, what's going on in South Africa at the time. So that's really shown the group was very tuned in and aware of sort of the anti-fascist, anti-prejudice struggle around the world.
And On Guard could be seen as like the way an establishment could give a tacit approval. You got people like Labour MPs writing into the paper, and certain Church of England figures as well, I think. And that's a really interesting outlet for that kind of section of society.
Absolutely. I mean, On Guard also contains a feature on one issue of from Paul Robeson, the African-American singer and activist, and it is very much, when the 43 group puts its address up, it puts its address on Guard. When it begins to hold political meetings, it holds meetings under the aegis of On Guard. It very much gives it an air of respectability. What it also does, it works as a fantastic way for the 43 group to justify being at fascist meetings, because if they turn up at a fascist, if someone from Edgware turns up at a fascist meeting in Bethnal Green, the police could say, "What are you doing here? You're just here to make trouble." But if they came with a stack of On Guards, they could say, "Well, we're here to, sell this newspaper. We're just exercising our freedom of speech like they are." So it's a really excellent weapon for the group. As well as On Guard, they also have a very effective intelligence operation using Jews who don't look Jewish or non-Jewish members and infiltrating them into fascist organizations. And they get a lot of intelligence. They're the first people to reveal that Oswald Mosley plans on coming back in October 1947. They uncover a plan of the fascists to print and publish and sell a fascist newspaper in Germany, which is against the law. And they pass it on to the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office gets that banned. They run a very effective intelligence operation. And the 43 group are also active in lobbying and trying to change the way the Jewish community responds to fascists. They believe that the position of the Jewish community is too passive. The establishment is only willing to either lobby or debate. They're not willing to take the fascists on. So they're forever advocating for the Jewish community to be more active in defending the fascists and taking the fight to them.
It's an interesting thing you raised up at the end. What were the main Jewish groups who were also in that kind of anti-fascist activist remit? And you've already kind of briefly discussed it as well, but what was their view of the 43 group and what it was doing?
So the main organisation, the main establishment organisation was called the Jewish Defence Committee for the Board of Deputies. And they are very much the group sees them as the old men who are willing to jaw but not war. They'll sit around and they'll talk. They'll go to they'll lobby MPs. They have a meeting with Home Secretary Tudor E. They'll publish pamphlets. They will put on lecture series. They will hire lawyers, perhaps, but they will do absolutely nothing that either breaks the law or brings the Jewish community into any form of disrepute. And the group sees them as, in the Yiddish, alte kackers, the old men who just sit around and talk. So, and in return, the Board of Deputies sees the 43 group as idiots, hooligans, jumped up youngsters who are full of themselves, who have no sense of all the good work they're doing. It should also be said that the Board of Deputies has its own spies, its own infiltrators, who are also very effective. They were able to bring down plans for two fascist organisations to merge at one point. So they are also, they are active in ways that the 43 group does not realise. I realised there's one incident where a 43 group spy undercover with the fascists is sent to guard a fascist organiser who happens to be the Board of Deputies spy.
There was another good story that I heard one of the ex-members saying is that he beats up a seller of a fascist newspaper, and then months later bumps into him at a 43 group meeting, and was undercover at the time and got the shit kicked out of him, I guess. That
was always happening. I think there was always this thing when the spies came out, there was probably a thing of people coming up and apologising to them. But yeah, I mean, the Board of Deputies, as I was saying, hated the 43 group and was forever trying to close it down. And it became a really sort of virulent, nasty argument that began occurring in the pages of the Jewish Chronicle.
Right.
And they were sort of, letters constantly going back and forth with them ripping into each other. And there was also another organisation called the Association of Jewish Ex-Servicemen, AJEX, and they were attached to what was referred to as the official defence structure. So they were attached to the Board of Deputies. They represented the Jewish ex-servicemen. They were very keen to take the fight to the fascists, but once again within the law. So they would hold meetings and platforms in areas right adjacent to where the fascists were holding meetings. And the 43 group basically starts as a splinter from them.
Mm-hmm. What was the position of the Labour government in regard to fascist organising, and how did the police treat those meetings, and how did they respond when the 43 group intervened in those meetings? This is three quite big questions, but if you could,
absolutely. So in January 1946, Clement Attlee convenes a cabinet committee on fascism, where they basically are charged with determining whether the fascists after the war pose a threat and whether or not existing legislation is deemed suitable enough for dealing with them. The committee comes back and says that the fascists in their current state do not pose any serious threat. And whilst there is the potential kernels for something to emerge, this shouldn't be taken too seriously at this moment in time. And existing legislation is perfectly satisfactory. For the next 2 years, basically, the Home Secretary Tudor Eade, whenever he is asked about this, whenever he is lobbied about this, refers to this report and these conclusions. And the government very much has this policy of legislation as it currently stands is fine. More important to the government at this period is returning to the principles of liberal democracy.
Right.
The fascists had to be interned during the war. Habeas corpus was suspended. This offends our liberal democratic ideals. We want to, go back to liberal democracy as quickly as possible. The best way we can show this is by ensuring that those people whose political rights we clamped down upon during the war are allowed to, say what they want and do as they please within the limits of the law, as it stands for all. And that is more important to them than protecting the rights and the safety of the Jewish community or any minority communities. So that's the position of the Labour government. The police, you will not be surprised to hear me say, do seem to have rather strong fascist sympathies. That is not, of course, the case across the board. Individual policemen and police officers and constables can be very supportive of the 43 group. The group tends to realise that those who have ex-service medals on their uniforms are normally more supportive. Sometimes they get a whisper from a policeman saying, give him one from me, and etc. But for the most part, there is a strong pro-fascist, anti-Semitic sympathies. This is for a number of reasons. The 1936 Public Order Act means that if protection is requested from the police by a speaker at a public meeting, the police have to provide that protection. So that means that if the fascists are having the meeting, they request protection, they're guarded by the police, which means the 43 group and other anti-fascists have to go through the police to get to the fascists. So already there is the police are getting in the 43 group's way and vice versa. So that's going to cause a lot of antipathy towards them. Then you have pre-existing anti-Semitism, which there is a lot of evidence of. One of the fascist speakers, Jeffrey Ham, is told very early on that if he comes into Bethnal Green speaking anti-Semitic politics, he will have no problems from the police, who tell him about the Public Order Act and tell him how he can weaponize it to protect him. And then you have, many incidents of out and out, anti-Semitic violence from the police. In one incident, a man is arrested for heckling and is subsequently, dragged to the ground and beaten up by the police. Someone tries to intervene. They beat him up as well. They drag him into a police station, and, the superintendent, who's a man called Charles Satterthwaite, has his constables pin these men to the walls and just starts beating the hell out of them.
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, there are some real horrendous incidents of police violence in this story. So there is anti-Semitism as a very strong reason for why the police are acting as they do. There is also the fact that the police cannot tell the communists in the 43 group apart. The Communist Party is also very active around this period, especially in the summer of 1947, when the most heaviest violence was. And quite often the communists and the Jews and the 43 group look the same because, of course, many members of the Communist Party are Jewish. Brothers might, one brother might be in the group, one brother might be in the Communist Party. There were members of the Communist Party who became members of the group. So they look the same. So the police don't really know who is who, and they just sort of see them all, as just communist agitators.
So just going off that, it's interesting how the Public Order Act, nominally brought into against the fascists in the 1930s, is now being retooled to help them in the 1940s.
Well, right from the outset, in 1936, once they were told they could not steward their own meetings, which is what the Public Order Act says, they have to rely on the police, and they become much more friendly with the police.
Right. And it's interesting as well that all these kind of the ban on public uniforms just meant that they kind of all dressed very similarly to give themselves a paramilitary look.
Absolutely.
Just looking outside of London for a second, because you said the group was most active in London, but there were kind of group activities outside of London. Where was the main kind of outside of London 43 group active? So
they had regional branches in Leeds, in Newcastle. In Newcastle, there was an already existing Jewish anti-fascist organisation which renamed itself the 43 Group. In Manchester, you have the Manchester Union for Jewish Ex-Servicemen called MUJEX. They affiliate with the 43 Group. So those are kind of the big ones. Then you have kind of smaller branches cropping up. Nowhere has a sustained fascist presence as London does. So you have these anti-fascist organisations, and some of them are coming out when the fascists are holding like street meetings. They're coming out to them, but the fascists aren't as active anywhere as they are in London. But they do in 1948 when Oswald Mosley launches the Union movement, which brings all these sort of disparate fascist organisations together. They do start going on the road and taking their meetings to various different cities, and then you have big anti-fascist turnouts. The biggest of these is in Brighton, where the police don't offer a fascist march any protection, and the 43 Group, local Jewish ex-servicemen, and the locals have a party as they completely tear into the fascists.
It's interesting that obviously different police forces have different responses. So, obviously in East London, they're very keen on protecting the fascists, but in Brighton they send two police officers to fulfil their obligations under the Public Order Act or something. Now, it's very difficult to ask a historian to deal in counterfactuals because you have to go off what happened and not what could have happened. But I guess going off your kind of research, what role did the 43 have in the decline of post-war British fascism? And if they didn't exist, do you think Mosley would have had more success?
What the 43 Group did was show the fascists that you could not target the Jewish community without a cost. This was not a community that was in any way willing to take it lying down anymore. So that if you wanted to take a platform into Ridley Road, which had a very strong Jewish presence, or any other Jewish area. If you wanted to put up anti-Semitic graffiti or publish have anti-Semitic newspapers, that came as a cost. Your free speech does harm. Therefore, you invite harm to yourself, because free speech does not mean speech without cost. And the 43 group demonstrated to the fascists that they could not do what they wanted anymore. You had to be really, really dedicated to be a fascist. And what that meant was that casual observers, people who, might have been a fascist, might have joined a movement if it was easier to do, if there wasn't a risk that you would be targeted, they began to move away, because, they began to see the dangers. If they didn't fancy being, having a tussle with a whole bunch of Jewish bruisers, you decide not to go to the meeting. And that means the fascist crowds begin to diminish. So the 43 group does begin to kind of put a stranglehold on the fascists. Now, there is an argument that had the 43 group not turned up, not smashed into the fascists, the post-war fascist attempts at revival would not have received the press they did. They, in the summer of 1947, it became a national story with the Battle of Ridley Road, and that brought thousands of people to their meetings. But publicity for the fascists is not necessarily a bad thing if it's the wrong sort of publicity. Mm-hmm. They were very much trying to legitimize themselves once again. So by associating with them with street violence, you're completely undercutting any claim they could make that they could lead responsibly in a time of crisis, which is what Mosley would have liked people to see of him, or to think of him as a responsible leader in a time of crisis. So the 43 group is absolutely, in my opinion, functioning in a way to prevent the fascists from really having huge success in getting the numbers they need, and making sure they get the wrong form of publicity, and showing them that there is a cost to being a fascist and attacking a minority community. Of course, the conditions aren't ripe in this, in the late 1940s for the fascists to succeed, and the chances of Oswald Mosley becoming prime minister in the early 50s is pretty slim. But had it not been for the 43 group, Mosley could have stayed in Britain. He goes to France and Ireland in 1951 and is basically out the country for the next 10 years. And the 43 group, made it difficult for him, and Mosley was somebody who kind of liked it a bit easy. He didn't quite have the sort of the zealous dedication that perhaps Hitler or Mussolini had. There's this theory that one of the reasons he pulled out of the Battle of Cable Street was that he was getting married in Germany 2 days later. He wasn't as fully committed as he perhaps needed to be. He liked the easier options. When the Union movement did not succeed, it was obvious it wasn't succeeding in 1948. He began to see himself as the leader of European fascism, where he could just, swan around the Mediterranean meeting other fascist luminaries. So they made it difficult for him. So history would be different if the group hadn't been there. But I'm not saying that means the fascists would have succeeded, but they might have been around more, and they might have just continued to make it unpleasant for the Jewish community.
And just thinking through the 43 group's legacy from then to today, I guess, maybe I'm going off a tangent, but I think anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is like an ever-present in most far-right politics, and you can see that mainly today with the theory of the Great Replacement, which, if you dig down into their kind of rhetoric, is controlled by a shadowy elite of international bankers or whoever they want, the code word they want. Do you think it's important to be retelling this story now in this context? I know as a historian you're concerned about the past and what happened in the past, but I mean, there's a reason why the book's coming out now, or you're researching the book now, and I wondered why you wanted to tell it right now in this moment. Was it just because it happened, you just got interested and you started writing it, or were there clues in today, or clues, there were indications in today's society that something like the 43 group needed to be put into the conversation?
It's interesting. When I first heard about the group from a friend in 2012, the far right was nothing like it is today. And our original, and still one of our intentions and ways to tell this story, is as a TV show.
Right.
And it was, you know, our attraction to it was that it was exciting and it was entertaining, and it was a story that we as North London Jews had never heard of, when we thought, you know, this should be the sort of story that should have legendary status in the Jewish community.
I mean, it's a rip-roaring tale. What can you say? Like, it's really exciting.
Exactly. So originally, I mean, it was very much we love this story, we love these characters. This is really... We were really happy to just be researching this and looking into this and telling this story, and saw it as inspiring and entertaining. And it was only when I started pitching the book and writing the book a few years ago, that sort of came around the time of the rise of the right was really beginning to reveal itself as a new force. Once again, I remember having a pitch meeting for the book the day after the Charlottesville.
Right.
So beginning to show just how relevant, not quite relevant, but potentially inspirational a story like this could be. And look, anti-fascists have, I'm sure, a whole wealth of various anti-fascist organizations over the past 60, 70 years to draw upon and to be inspired by. And they have, I'm sure lessons could be drawn from the 43 group, but I don't know, you know, it's a completely different period of time. But certainly from the perspective of coming at it from the Jewish perspective, and the perspective of the Jewish community, where there hasn't been quite the same level of anti-fascist resistance. It's come up when it's needed to come up. The 43 group had a successor organization called the 62 group, and then there is the Community Security Trust, the CST, which very much has kept an eye on the fascists, and he is very conscious of the threats posed to the Jewish community. And then you have Searchlight Magazine, which, you know, has very much kept its eye on the fascists. You know, these coming from the sort of the Jewish anti-fascist perspective. But sort of these institutionally, these organizations are there. But what that has meant is there hasn't been perhaps the same level of street level organizing, like getting the kids out into the streets against the fascists in the same way. So for me, having the opportunity to tell this story, I hope potentially inspires people within the Jewish community, as well as all other minority communities who could potentially be targeted, to show that it is a wonderful thing to not fear potentially those who would get rid of you, and to stand up as a community, to identify as a community, standing up for yourselves and fighting back, and show, you know, we're strong and we're not going anywhere.
And on that note, I'm going to probably end this interview here, but thank you so much for coming in and talking for us. I've learnt a lot of new stuff as well, and I've done some research already. The book is called We Fight Fascists, and it is available from Verso Books, and every single good bookshop, or every good bookshop has to have this book, basically. And I'm really looking forward to reading it as well.
I will be at the Jewish Book Week on the 1st of March.
Which is where, in London? In London.
Jewish Book Week in London, at King's Place on the 1st of March, where I'll be on stage with some of the members of the 43 group.
Oh, exciting. I'll make sure I'll get a ticket for that instead of it being sold out. Thank you for listening. If you want to support the podcast, you can give us money on our Patreon, which is patreon.com/12rules for what. I don't usually do this bit, so it's a bit of a different one. You can also follow our Twitter, which is at 12rules for what on Twitter. We tweet out all our episodes, and you can interact with us, and we will eventually get back to you. Other than that, thank you for listening, and